Well, welcome. We only have about 45 minutes or so. So what I plan on doing is rapidly speaking for about half an hour, and then I'll give you 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So what we're trying to do is to help you think through cultural engagement. So what I mean by that is you're a Christian, you want to affect change beyond yourself, beyond your family, beyond your marriage. You want to affect change in the broader culture. What are some things you could be thinking about or supporting or financing or building that would help to bring about greater change in the public square? So first of all, let's talk about culture, because people have different views of what culture is. A lot of times people think culture is ethnicity. It's not ethnicity. It's nothing to do with ethnicity. Culture is essentially your values, the institutions, the structures, your views of family, for example, your views of marriage, your views of business, law, education, your views of education, your views of law in culture. Now, most Christians that I speak to understand intuitively that they're trying to shape themselves into Christ-likeness and make sure their lives are conformed to biblical standards. They're totally fine with the idea of shaping their marriage into Christ-likeness. If they're business owners, they want to shape their business into a Christ-centered business. But when it comes suddenly to saying, okay, but how are you shaping the rest of culture, like outside of yourself, your marriage, your business, it seems kind of strange for them to think about that. It almost seems un-Christian. Like, are we allowed to be involved in shaping educational institutions, financial organizations, politics? And frankly, I'll tell you straight up, I think I was taught growing up to stay out of that stuff. You just focus on your marriage, you focus on your family, and you let the world go to hell in a handbasket. That was kind of the mindset, right? So, again, culture is the norms, the structures, the institutions, the diet, the customs, the behaviors that a society or a nation adheres to. And undergirding those values and beliefs, there's always an authority or authorities in the plural that are trying to govern and shape those values and those norms. I would like to propose that every society fundamentally is a theocracy. Every society is a theocracy. Every culture therefore, is shaped by some sort of religious law. So what I mean by a theocracy, a formal theocracy, is where the head of state, that everyone acknowledges as a head of state, is God. So we would see this in an Islamic country under Sharia law, where they would see ultimately as Allah as having absolute authority out of all of life. So if they're trying to figure out how to write laws, how to educate people, it's all religious. The sleight of hand that we've seen in the West is this lie that secularism is non-religious. It's not religious. So the notion that many of us grew up with is we live in the West. The West is a place where everyone's welcome to come. All worldviews are accepted. All worldviews have opportunities to flourish. But if you think about it, what actually happens then, in order to oversee all of that, the state has to become quote unquote God. Obviously, they don't use that language, but they become the all-powerful, all-seeing arbiter as to human behavior, rights, and wrongs. So an example of this, and maybe we weren't thinking about this when it happened, but in 2005, the Canadian state redefined marriage. So a historical institution, one man and one woman for life. There were always divorce laws, of course. That was considered marriage. And then 10 years later, the U.S. is always 5 to 10 years behind us in terms of the downward slide. 10 years later in 2015, the U.S. Also changed its marriage laws. Well, who decides that that's even allowable? The state. The state decides what marriage is. Now, you and I as Christians know the state doesn't actually have the authority to define what marriage is. So what if the state, just to use an example, what if the state decided we're all humans, but from here forward, we're all squirrels? So that we're going to redefine reality. You are a squirrel, sir. You are a squirrel. You are a squirrel. We're all squirrels. You'd say, you can't just redefine reality. Like, what authority do you have to decide all of a sudden, after thousands of years of human history, that this is a squirrel or that's a squirrel? That would be a ludicrous example that we would all immediately react to. Well, historically, everyone would have reacted in a variety of cultures to the notion that the state can suddenly redefine marriage, but it has. And the reason why that was accepted so quickly by Western people is because knowingly or unknowingly, mostly unknowingly, the average Westerner believes that the state is the de facto ultimate authority on all matters of faith and practice. So the state then is shaping culture. Believers, however, are called to shape culture according to God's laws. And the laws of God don't just apply to your behavior. They don't just apply to the behavior of couples in marriage. They also apply to statecraft. They apply to education. They apply to all areas of life. Now, here are several examples. I'll go through them quickly, whereby believers are called to shape culture according to God's laws. And when they shape culture according to God's laws, in a broken world, it's often in contrast to how their neighbors are trying to shape those same laws. So, for instance, we shape marriage, notice the contrast, we shape marriage differently than the pagans do. In Leviticus 18, and you shall not lie sexually with your neighbor's wife, and so make yourself unclean with her. You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Moloch, that's the neighbor, the pagan god, and so profane the name of the Lord your God. I am the Lord. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. You shall not lie with any animal so as to make yourself unclean with it. Neither shall any woman give herself to an animal to lie with it. It is perversion. So there's a contrast there. And the main contrast, especially with regard to the child sacrifice, is Moloch. The people of God do things differently than the Molochites do. So we shape marriage differently. We shape worship differently. Exodus 32:1, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of a land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. He's gone. He hasn't come back." And of course, you know the rest of the narrative is they're chastised for that and they're rebuked. So we're called to shape worship differently than the pagans. We don't take our cue from the pagans in terms of how we worship. We take it from the Word of God. We're even called to shape our partnerships differently. In Paul's letter to the Corinthian church, 2 Corinthians 6:17, verses surrounding it, people often apply this to marriage, but no mention of marriage is actually made. This is to all human partnerships where there's a yoking. Business partnerships, you never go into business with an unbeliever with a 50-50 relationship. It's unbiblical. You never marry an unbeliever. It's unbiblical. Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. You can be in a certain, we're all in certain types of partnerships with unbelievers. Maybe the 25% shareholder in a company or the 10% shareholder in a company. Well, you need to realize that in doing that, you have the lesser say in the company. You have to submit to the values of that company. But it's especially dangerous when you seek to be yoked to them in a way where there's a true, it puts you in a position where there's literally a conflict between how you spend your money, for example, or what decisions you make in business ethics. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? What fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? What portion does a believer have with an unbeliever? And it goes on to say, therefore, go out of their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord. Touch no unclean thing. So in intimate relationships, we are to be separate from the world. If your best friend is an unbeliever, you need to repent of that. How many times have you heard that before? If your best friend is an unbeliever, you need to repent of that. Because that's an equal yoking. That's an equal yoking. We shape leadership differently. The Christian pastor is told in 1 Peter 5:3, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. Why? Because the world practices that kind of godless dominance in leadership. We do business differently. A false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. So we practice business ethics in accordance with God's word. We could go on and on and on. We could point out examples in the Bible where to raise our children differently, or to conduct ourselves in marriage differently, or to treat our bodies differently. We are to interact in business differently. We worship differently. All spheres of life. God has provided standards that we are to subscribe to. We live by a different set of values, and so we shape culture according to those values, and those values are biblical values, and we shouldn't be ashamed of that. I am very much interested. Call me a far-right extremist, whatever you want. I want Canada to be shaped according to biblical values, period. I'm not ashamed to say that. Not secular values, not godless values. I want our laws to be to honor God's laws. It doesn't mean that God has laws about who should park on the street, how many vehicles you should have, or how many fire extinguishers you should have in a building. Those might be extensions to basic laws surrounding, for example, the preservation of life. But when it comes to criminal law, the Bible has something to say about that. Thou shalt not murder, don't steal, don't covet. So laws pertaining to property rights, laws pertaining to freedom of religion. And by the way, just as a sidebar, whenever you start talking about God's laws in Canadian culture, one of the biggest pushbacks you get are from believers that say, are you trying to force Christianity upon heathens? It's like, no, actually, we're trying to shape a culture within which heathens can make it out of the womb, within which heathens can actually freely worship their false gods. So to use an illustration, there's not one single non-Christian country in the world where, apart from brief economic opportunities like Saudi Arabia when there's an oil boom, there's not one single notable country in the world that is not based on God's laws that people are flocking to immigrate to. They don't go there. Nobody wants to live under Sharia law. Nobody wants to live under Hindu law. Nobody wants to live in atheist North Korea. Nobody wants to live in animistic mid-Africa, because those countries don't have liberty. They don't have freedom of worship. So because there's no coercion in true Christianity, the Christian faith creates a box and boundaries and parameters within which even people that disagree with us can actually function to a certain measure, right? There's limits to it, of course. So we want to shape God's world according to God's commandment. If he's the creator, it seems to me to make a lot of sense that the creator should have the final say in how the creature functions, even in the civil realm. So that's all background. Very quickly, what I want to do. What can we do? Hands-on stuff. What can we do as Christians to shape culture? Well, broadly speaking, it starts with the mind. So this is what we're doing even in this seminar. We want to shape your mind. We have to teach systematically on cultural issues and their application to life from a biblical perspective. We need to help Christians think Christianly about themselves, about marriage, about money, about political engagement, about educating their children, about property rights. The Bible has something to say about that. Don't covet, don't steal. It's your property rights. We want to help people to think critically about these issues. We're having a conference here in December you might want to attend in Ezra. It's put on by Ezra Institute. They have a lot of good articles in the realm of thinking culturally. So we need to be people that are leaning in and thinking systematically about these issues. The second thing you need to decide is where you're going to live. And once you've decided that, how are you going to shape that culture? The reason why I mention this is because during the the pandemic and everything that was going on, as a lot of even Canadians saw, including myself, many of you, I'm sure it crossed all of our minds that can we even stay in this country, right? And some of our dear brothers and sisters left, and we're like, God bless you, we respect that, and many stayed. But if you're going to shape a culture, you need to decide, are you going to be there or not? And it looks like most of you are sticking around. There are some key passages of Scripture that weigh into the discussion about staying versus fleeing. In Matthew chapter 10, I commend that to your study. The Bible talks about if you go into one town and you're persecuted, you can flee to the next. So there's times when, just like in Paul's ministry, we've been studying the book of Acts, where he had to get out of Dodge, so to speak, because his life was on the line. But then if you fast forward to Revelation 2, it says, don't fear what you're about to suffer. So there's this wisdom issue. You can't flee habitually. Like at some point, you're going to have to stop and take a couple punches on the chin. You can't flee habitually. And unlike perhaps our Puritan forebears, or for some of you, Anabaptist forebears, who were able to literally move to another country or different continent for religious freedom because there was just a tiny little population there, or it was open territory, those places don't exist anymore in the world. So there's no newly discovered continent that you can go to colonize. You might be able to find a place that's, again, 5 to 10 years behind the nonsense, but there literally is no place that you can go to escape this global disease of wokeism and neo-paganism and cultural Marxism that is rising. Many of you know we have a church plant in Texas composed largely of people that left Canada during the pandemic, and I'll be preaching there on January the 21st. They're in rural Texas, but they'll tell you straight up, if you go into the bigger cities, the Windsor-sized cities or Toronto-sized cities in Texas, it's just as bad, if not worse, than in Ontario. Okay? So this disease is literally everywhere. So you need to determine, has the Lord perhaps at this point in time called me to get out of Dodge, or has he called me to stay and fight and build? So if you're in the second camp, you are the ones I especially want to be talking to this afternoon. So I want to throw out several ideas. So this is like pretty basic stuff, but it might be stuff that you're not used to thinking through. If we, let's say as individual Christians, or I believe there's people at this conference from a few different churches, from your specific church or our church, we're wanting to bring about substantive change in our own culture, in our own society. The first thing you need to do is you need to commit to a long-term mindset. You don't change things in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. You need to think generationally, okay? But you can start acting today. You can start acting differently today, but you have to think long-term, 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 okay? I was the planting pastor of this church. We started with 5 people, and then you get to 10 people, and then 20 people, and then 30 people, and then we went public. And our church has a culture about it, and it takes years to forge that culture. Preaching, teaching, leadership appointments, individual conversations, meetings, documents. It takes years to forge the culture of a little group like this here at Harvest Bible Church in Windsor. Well, how much longer do you think it would take to reshape an existing entity like Essex County or Ontario, Canada, or the Dominion of Canada? It takes a long, long, long time. You don't just run someone through a couple election cycles and voila, all the problems are fixed. It took us a long time to get here, even in terms of the rampant sexual promiscuity that we see in our culture. That largely started with Trudeau the First, King Trudeau the First, with his omnibus bill, and then that started to take hold in the 1960s and early 70s. That's like 55 years ago to get to this point. So it would take, I think, at least that to turn the clock back 50 years, maybe longer, right? Because people tend to move more towards craziness than godliness. So we need to think long term. And when you think long term, you get discouraged much less quickly, okay, when you think long term. But if you're like, I can't handle it, Canada's a wreck. If things don't change in the next election cycle, I'm leaving. Then leave now. Leave now. because it's not going to change in the next election cycle or the one after that. It's going to take a few generations minimally. And if Jesus comes back, then we don't have to worry about it. But in the meanwhile, we don't sit in our hands and do nothing. So here are some specific things. I'm a believer in forming beachheads. So when I love illustrations from military strategy. I think there's actually a lot of tie-ins to the way the church does ministry. So when you think of the Allies trying to take out the Axis forces in World War II, Hitler had swept through most of Europe before, for example, the US really even got involved in the war. I mean, he had taken a lot of land, conquered a lot of territory. Well, you don't just start dropping people randomly here and there, a few guys in Belgium, a few guys in France, a few guys in Russia, and hope that somehow they're going to, shoo out these entrenched forces. They're entrenched. They've built infrastructure. They brought in mechanized weaponry. They have guns pointed at you. They have aircraft bases. So how do we do this? We form beachheads. We get a whole bunch of guys, and we form basically a triangle, and we push in inland. We land on a beach, and we fight hard, and we push in. We penetrate, and we keep doing it. Sometimes we're going to get pushed back, but ultimately you concentrate your forces in one or two or a limited number of locations, and inch by inch, square mile by square mile, you start to take back Europe. That's how it happened, and it took years. World War II was 7 years or something like that? It took a long, long time. So we need to form beachheads. So there are a very small number, I believe, of Christians in Canada that think this way and are actually prepared to fight back. A very small number. So the evangelical population in Canada, they estimate, is at 6.5%, 7%. Most of them have flaked out. They're diet Christians. They're low-cal Christians. They're interested in going to church, dropping their kids off at youth group, picking up an Awana program, and leaving. They're not thinking about Christian business strategies. They're not thinking about running for office. They're not thinking about resisting anything. Okay, so we're down to a very small number. So it makes sense to me then that the best thing to do is to form beachheads, to identify the people that think in a similar way and move to those areas. And one of those areas, I believe, is Essex County, okay? Because we have a big church here and several other smaller churches and a lot of people that are active and seeking to push back. This area is a place of resistance, and our opponents know that. So we're just going to talk about our area. If you're in another area, well, you can put the same practices into play in your specific community. So one of the fundamental things we need to do is we need to start educational institutions. And Chris mentioned this, or maybe it was Adam. One of the main reasons why we started the Harvest Classical Academy is because we want to get ahead of the curve when it comes to the younger generation. In addition to that, we are promoting and actively encouraging people that want to school at home, school your kids at home. But get the heck out of the public school system last year. Get out. Okay? Get out. I can guarantee you don't have to listen to me. You can do whatever you want. You have sovereignty over your kids. You do not have enough time in your day to unindoctrinate the things the average child is being exposed to. I'm focusing specifically on elementary and high school. I don't care how smart you are, how connected of a Christian you are, you do not have enough time in your day to deprogram the things your kids are hearing, watching, sensing, and feeling in the public system. It is literally anti-Christ. It's anti-Christ. And when I was a younger parent, and that wasn't that long ago, I would even make decisions now differently than I would 10, 15 years ago. So our philosophy was the kids are going Christian grade 1 to 8, then they're going Catholic because it's kind of in between, and then we'll prep them for the trades or university or college, whatever they do after that. I wouldn't let my kids anywhere near a secular high school today. I wouldn't let them anywhere near it because I don't have time to deprogram them. So getting our kids into specific Christian educational institutions is really, really important. I happen to think classical education is the best. That's why we're doing it. And classical education, basically, you teach them how to, you dump the information in phase 1, you help them to think through the information phase 2, and you help them to communicate the information phase 3. That's how people used to be educated, right? Not the way most of us were when you went to school and you came out unless you were just really smart, which I wasn't. And you didn't feel like you learned too much of anything. Like, how do you go through 3 or 4 years of French and I don't hardly speak a lick of it? How do you go through 13 years of elementary school? You go to college and your Greek professor is like, okay, we're going to talk about participles. And you're like, what in the world is a participle? How does that happen? It happens with educational systems that are non-classical, right? So making sure we're getting ahead of the curve by training up the next generation for Christ is really, really important. And these are in no particular order, by the way. But the second thing I want to challenge a cultural notion, and that is I think we need bigger churches, not smaller churches. I think we need bigger churches. Now, it's not because I think bigger churches are innately better. The size of your church, in terms of its numbers, doesn't make you more or less godly. We would acknowledge that. Like how could you argue that if you have 500 people in a room, they're more spiritual than if you have 50? So it's not that. I'm not saying that you can't be taught, that you can't educate, that you can't discipline, that you can't preach to 10 people as well as you could to 10,000. But when it comes to cultural change, numbers matter. And small churches, they don't have the resources to start Christian schools. They don't have the resources to start seminaries. They don't have the resources to get large numbers of people to vote godly people into office. It's a numbers game. So I've never bought into the myth, and I can say this because I've pastored this church and it was tiny when it's large. It doesn't really matter to me about the size, but numbers matter when it comes to cultural engagement. The more people you have, I can guarantee you, the more afraid politicians are that oppose you to mess with your church. It's just the way the world works. You may like it or not like it. Oh, well. If the health unit drives by a church of 5 people and they have 5 employees, they think they can pick on you. It's different than if they're driving by a church of whatever, several hundred or several thousand. So I saw this during the pandemic. I'll tell you a quick story to this effect. This is more about a broader church. I will never forget being in a meeting with the Assistant Attorney General for Ontario, the Assistant Medical Director, whatever their name is, and attorneys for the province of Ontario. This is back in June of 2020. And we met with them, and we had a letter in our hand that had 445 church signatures on it. And we said, very kindly, this was on a Thursday, you will open our churches by Monday or we'll sue you. And on Monday, Ford got up and okay, we're making an announcement. We're going to open the churches. And the businesses weren't even opened yet. And that's when I knew it was politics. It was sheer numbers. Now, you know why he didn't stick with that come lockdown number 2? Because only about 15 of those churches meant it. So when he suddenly realized, oh, those 445 didn't actually mean it. We can push them around. We can manipulate them. That's why they didn't let our churches stay open lockdown 2 and lockdown 3. But I will never forget coming out of that meeting thinking, we gave him a date, a time, a place, and he opened our churches on Monday. And a lot of business leaders were upset because they weren't all opened yet. I knew it's politics, it's numbers. This is a guy getting up saying we're all dying of a pandemic. So right from the beginning of the pandemic, I knew it was politics. I had evidence it was politics right from the get-go. And that shaped my thinking for how I responded from there on in. So you have to think about this. Numbers matter. In a broken world, if there's a little scrawny guy standing across the schoolyard from you that weighs 95 pounds, soaking wet, versus a guy that's 300 pounds and pumps iron, you're going to think twice about who you're going to bully. So, large churches have a greater capacity to intimidate evildoers. Larger churches, larger groups of Christians have a greater capacity to affect change in culture. We may not like that. but that's the way it is. So consolidating Christians into larger communities, I think, is a strategic thing. One of the things we've been working on a little bit as a church with others, because it's not our primary mission and I'm not talking about the church organized, like as a charitable organization, but the people in our church, is we wanted to start a credit union so that people could do their day-to-day banking out from the woke banking systems. I'm sure those of you that are at TD, CIBC, Scotiabank, you've seen all the gay promotional material on their apps and their posters and all that kind of stuff, right? You give them your money, they invest it, take the money from your money, and they pay for stuff like that, okay? Well, there was a time when I would walk into the bank and I would say, I want to meet with the manager. And I'd sit down with her and I'd say, I have a problem with this. I have a problem with walking in the bank and seeing the gay flag. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Rock, who pays for it? Oh, it's our corporate profits. No, that's my money that you're investing that's paying for it. And I'm offended. I don't want to go into the bank and see the gay flag. So a little while later, I don't know if it was me or just a lot of people complaining the gay flag was gone. But that was like 10 years ago. Now they don't care. With these social equity scores and that, they're all doing it. The credit unions aren't as bad as them yet. Now, in the process of researching this, it's a little bit difficult. And again, this is just throwing out ideas to help stir your thinking. What we're thinking about instead is starting some sort of a Christian private equity company first, and then the credit union after. So the way that would work, as I understand it, all of you have wealth. Those of you that are younger, you may have $500 in the bank. Those of you that are older might be worth $3-4 million in property and investments and pension plans, whatever. And most people from early 20s onwards are investing their money in something. Short-term guaranteed income deposits, TFSAs, RSPs, RESPs for their kids, mutual funds, on and on and on and on. And 99.9% of that is invested with the pagans. The pagans are profiting off of your money. Think of how many people in our church, I don't know what it would turn out to, but if we calculated the net worth of just the Christians in Essex County, I bet it would be billions of dollars. Billions of dollars. Well, if we started investing our money collectively in a values-based Christian institution, we could then provide mortgages. We could then provide short-term and long-term loans to like-minded people. The Muslims do this all the time, but Christians are like, well, we don't do that. We're just waiting for Jesus to come back, right? So 3 houses ago, we had a house on Mark Avenue here in Windsor. We lived there for 12 years. We put it up for sale. We received an offer from a young woman. I looked at the name. It was an Arab name. Met with her. She was in the hijab. She was about 27 years old. I'm thinking, how can you afford this? She's a new engineer in Michigan, just graduated from school. She was the person putting the offer in on at the time a $315,000 house, which would be probably worth $700 now. This isn't a starter home. How do you afford this? Well, she told me her mortgage is coming from the Shia Muslim community in Windsor. And her mom and dad are going to be living there. They're going to help pay for it. And her brother, I think his wife, is going to live there. So it's going to be like a multi-generational family. And the mortgage is not from TD. It's not from Scotiabank. It's from the Shia Muslim community, which is the minority Muslim community in Windsor. The Sunnis are much, much more numerous, right? Well, again, that community, if you want to call it that, are composed of relatively new first-generation immigrants to Canada. And right out of the get-go, it's like, hey, we're going to invest our money. In fact, if you want to learn how to handle money, talk to first-generation immigrants of any culture. They know how to handle money. They know how to start businesses. We just, whatever, mañana. We'll just go the route that everyone else goes. Why would I ever ask my grandfather for a mortgage? Why would I ever approach a Christian in the church? Why would the church ever talk about this? Let's just go to the woke banking institutions and give them our money for 25 years, right? So we have to learn to think differently in an anti-Christian culture. And when I say differently, it's actually better. Holding mortgages. Those of you that have the wherewithal, have you ever thought about liquidating your invested assets and relending it in the form of mortgages to young Christians. I know of a man in the church that does that. He's financially wealthy and he lends money. He makes a buck off it. He charges reasonable interest, but we're essentially keeping money within the Christian community. So who's getting the interest off that? He's getting it. Then he can lend out more. Right? So the money is still staying within the quote unquote kingdom of God. It would be good for Christians to start thinking about this. Establishing multiple homes on singular properties. When Susie and I bought our first house in 1997, it was worth 3 years of income for me. That same house would be worth about 10 years of income for a couple starting out. So the prices of houses have gone like this, and wages they've gone up. Let's say wages have doubled, I would guesstimate. But the cost of the house has gone up sixfold. So just to get in the door, my son and my daughter-in-law live up in Cambridge. They were telling me that they figured just to get into the first house, they have to save up in cash $100,000. I had to save up $7,000, right? $100,000. That takes a long time to save up $100,000, and you still have a hefty mortgage just to get in, right? So one of the things Susie and I are doing is we're thinking about this whole idea of inheritance. So typically how inheritances work, because people live to 75, 80 in Canada, is you work for you work for 30, 40 years, then you retire for 20, sometimes for 30 years for some people, and then you're like 80 years old or 85 years old, you die, and then you pass on your money to your kids who are already like 55, 60 years old. And it's like, thanks for the money, but I don't really need it, because by 50 or 60, you should be self-sufficient, right? So we're living so long that the generation that really benefits is usually two behind us. It's usually like our grandchildren. So what Susie and I are attempting to do is to help our children more now. Like, we don't need to save up a lot of money. I can trust God for tomorrow. So if I have a little extra money in the bank, I recently just paid off the student loans for my daughter-in-law. We sold a cottage up north. We gave each of our kids $5,000. We passed on a $5,000 vehicle to one of our children. We've probably forked out 30, 40 grand in the last few years to our children now, because they need it now. They don't need it when they're 55 or 60, right? Now, my strategy is also, if I give them enough money, they'll take care of me when I'm older. Right? I don't know if that's going to happen or not. But maybe instead of being so, I would say, non-strategic would be the best way of putting it. The worst would be selfish. Have you been thinking about giving more of your, if you're my age or older, have you been thinking about maybe giving away more of your money now to the next generation to help them along, instead of hoarding it up, worrying like, who's going to take care of me when I'm 80 or 90? So I find much joy in helping my kids now, rather than, again, waiting until they're my age and then suddenly them inheriting whatever wealth we have at the time. But establishing multiple homes in the same property, I think it's true that every county municipality in Essex County, for example, now has allowances for 2 houses on every property. There might be some exceptions to that. Generally, the second house or residence has to be smaller. It has to be set back from the road compared to the main. It can't have like a separate entrance, because I don't want people severing. But I think we're probably moving back into some ancient history from our vantage point, where more and more people are going to need to start having multiple buildings on the same property. So one of my children and their family live on our property, and it's not like, they're the proverbial kid that will never move out. It's getting a free ride. It's not like that. It's a strategic move to help them along so that they can get established as a young couple. Starting businesses. Now, not everybody is an entrepreneur, and that's fine. If everybody was an entrepreneur, we'd have no workers. We'd have no managers. But let's just pull a number out of the air. Let's say 5% of the population are entrepreneurs and 10% are managers, foremen, overseer types, and then the rest are workers. That'd be fine. But I'm really, really encouraging Christians who have entrepreneurial gifts to start businesses. You may say, well, I don't really need to. I work for a corporation. I have a good salary. Okay, well, that's fine for you, but have you thought more broadly about the world around you? If it might be more comfortable for you to work for the big corporation, but maybe for the benefit of the beachhead, for the benefit of the broader Christian community, have you thought about starting a business so that you can employ like-minded people with the same values, with a little greater job security? You can still have employment agreements. You can still fire them if they don't show up to work on time. You don't have to pay them 3 times what the going rate is. But have you thought about strategically using your gifts and ability to start businesses, and then not just starting businesses, but employing like-minded people? Again, I think we can learn a lesson from immigrants, like more recent immigrants. So there's a young man in the church. He's of German Mennonite background. He works at a very, I would say, financially lucrative manufacturing company. Every employee there is Mennonite. Everybody knows each other. The owner's not, but every employee is Mennonite. They all know each other. They have a similar work ethic. They can vouch for one another. That's not unusual, Christian. But if it's almost like in our culture, if you had a business and everyone worked there was a Christian, but well, that's a bad witness. Where are the Muslims? Where are the Hindus? Where are the Buddhists? Well, we minister to them. But our first and foremost responsibility is to the household of faith, to provide for one another. So I think Christians, frankly, need to be more discriminate in how they invest their time, how they invest their money, how they invest their resources so they can be a blessing to others. Bartering, trading, growing food, there's an increased movement in that. It's probably not going to change your life radically, but it's something to think about. Reducing debt. If you have a mortgage, and you have the wherewithal or means, pay the thing off. Pay it off as quickly as possible. We paid our house off in Windsor many years ago. We moved to the county. We took another mortgage out. Thought, I got a lot of years left in me. I had a mortgage that was maybe like 2%. And everything happened in the pandemic. I'm going to pay this thing off. The bank's like, you're nuts. Don't pay it off. Like, take the money and invest the difference. It's like, I don't care if I make $1,000 more a year off. I'm paying my house off. Well, fortunately I did, because the rates went up significantly, right? So it's not necessarily the best financial sense. Like you could maybe say, I'm going to max out my mortgage because I can make more money out in mutual funds or whatever. I don't care. I do not want to owe woke banks a dime. So if you have the opportunity, every time you have extra money, go to the bank or go online and make an extra payment, make an extra payment, make an extra payment. Pay your house off as quickly and as fast as you possibly can. And then I'll say this, if you're a person that tends to get in trouble with the law now and again because of your stance, like me, it's not a bad idea if you're married to take your name off the deed of your property. I did. I'm just my wife's tenant farmer. I'm her farmhand, right? So it's a strange thing to think about, but when I was ticketed and fined, facing up to $600,000 in fines, I didn't know how that was all going to end. Ultimately, I paid $900 to a charity. But at the time, I didn't know what was going to happen. And so what I did is I went to my lawyer and I said, I want to turn all my assets over to my wife. He said, well, you can do that because she's much less likely to get in trouble with the law than you are. So sometimes you have to get down to brass tacks with people and planting these seeds in people's minds. They don't think about this. Protect yourself. You can't ultimately protect yourself completely. But for $450, if you can take your name off the mortgage and protect your family's assets, why would you not do that? If you have a mortgage, one of the pieces of advice I would give to people is to put 3 mortgages on your house. I did that for many years. So you put 3 mortgages on your house. There's financial institutions that will help set that up for you. They're all staggered terms. So let's say you have a 25-year mortgage. You have a third of it in a 1-year term. You have a third of it in a 3-year term. You have a third of it in a 5-year term, all at different interest rates, all renewing at different times. That way, in this crazy world of ours where interest rates go up and down, nothing is ever all renewing at the same time. So I've heard people start to get concerned who have mortgages still. They're like, oh yeah, I locked in at 2%. Next year it's coming up for renewal. I'm going to be like 6, 7%. Well, a better way to do it is to never allow all your mortgage to renew at the same time. Put various mortgages on your property. There's ways of doing that. Just simple things to help diversify your income. Final thing I'll mention, run for office. If you have the wherewithal, run for office, get involved in a political party. We have 3 start a political party, run independently. We have 3 options: municipal, provincial, and federal. There's going to be different views, even among Christians, on what that should look like, who you should vote for. That's fine. We can spar and debate on those issues in the life of our church, outside of Christian worship services, preferably. But minimally, just having people engaged in the political process, I think, is a very wise thing. We'd like to encourage more and more of that. Okay? Do I have any time for questions? Okay, 5 minutes. So, do you have any questions you want to ask that I could maybe help you work through? Alex?
I work in the States and licensed to practice law.
Mm-hmm.
And I recently left the corporate world, like you said. Went out on my own and started my own law practice. And within the next year, I hope to expand that into Windsor too once I get my licensing in order. So I know you touched on like principles for entrepreneurs, but if you go into more detail on that, like being able to form or structure a business like from the very beginning and do it Christianly.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to that, but and obviously it's going to it's going to be different between starting a convenience store as opposed to starting a law firm. So you want to familiarize yourself with the processes, the minimal legal process in your jurisdiction, right? And follow those because you can't get around it. But one thing I could say to all Christians is you have to start with a thoroughly Christian worldview. You have to know, like, my job, my occupation is a spiritual calling. Every one of you is in ministry. You may be doing a good job of it, or you may not be doing a good job of it. There's no sense in which we're all to be gunning for pastoral roles. Whether you're an artist, a tradesman, you need to serve the Lord as unto the Lord. You need to have a clear notion in your mind. I am a Christian first and a lawyer second. And then when I practice law, I'm a Christian in the way I do law. So you need to have a solid commitment to Christ, and then make sure, of course, that you have assessed yourself, get input from other people. Am I the kind of person that's built and geared and gifted for entrepreneurial work? If you are, go for it. If someone says, Alex, you know what, you're a great lawyer, but you're more of a staff lawyer, man. But such and such is going to start a law firm, go work for him or her. Making sure that you're in the area that you can be an A in is super important. I've said this to people in Christian ministry, so in the context of a church. In the old days, it was like you start off as an intern, you become a youth pastor, you become an associate pastor, and then you, quote unquote, get your own church as a lead pastor. That's like the highest rung. People would say that to me when I was a youth pastor. When are you going to become a senior pastor? I said, I hope I never will. I had no interest in that at the time. So, blooming where you're planted, we say to the guys in our church, it would be better to be an A+++ youth pastor for your entire life than a C- lead pastor. If God has gifted you in that area, bloom where you're planted. If God has gifted you as an entrepreneur, A+, bloom where you're planted. But if you're gifted as a foreman, a manager, not the guy at the top of the heap that bears all the pressure and the weight of the responsibility, but you do best as a manager, that's where you flourish, that's where you're an A+, bloom there. If you're a worker, a line worker, a tradesman, the guy swinging the hammer, guy pushing papers, whatever it is, that's where you're an A+, bloom there. So, solid Christian worldview. Obviously, you want to follow a good, solid business plan in your jurisdiction, depending on the nature of your business. clear sense of a Christian calling and understanding of your gifts and abilities is really, really critical. And then a lot of it is risk-taking. It's stepping out in faith. I remember when our church was seven adults, 7 people was our membership. And one of the fellows at the time said, Aaron, what would you do if the church only stayed as 7? I said, we're going to be the best church of 7 you've ever seen, right? So I had no idea what God had in store in terms of numbers or size, but I felt a holy calling to plant this church. And whether it was going to stay at 7 people or 70 people or whatever, the Lord gave me the faith to be able to do that. So you kind of have to have that call to that specific area, to that specific vocation. And then I think the Lord will honor that. It's not going to be easy, but he will honor that. And then you're always making adjustments along the way. Yeah. One more quick one. Yep.
Do you have a Christian directory currently for businesses in the church?
We do. We have an app. And in that app, we call it the Harvest Village. So in the Harvest Village, people can list by categories Christian businesses that they, not that they work for, but that they own or operate. So we used to be a little bit remiss to do that because like, wow, we don't want, church and your own financial interests to overlap. But then someone needs a plumber and they're giving money to Joe the pagan plumber. Why would you not want to give it to Joe the Christian plumber? Why would you not want to give it to someone who aligns with your values? So people who are, you have to be careful because it doesn't mean that if someone's name is in our app that they're really good at what they do. We don't necessarily know, right? You need to vet and ask questions, but at least there's a starting point. Okay, this person babysits, or this person is a tradesperson, or they sell insurance or whatever, and I know that they align with my worldview. Yeah. Was there a hand over here? Yeah.
What would you say to a Christian man who obviously wants to be a leader in the community, but and wants to express their value system, push it out there, but has a confidence issue of entering that forum that hasn't yet, but has the desire to?
Yeah. So confidence is partly a result of your prayer life and a burning affirmation from God's Spirit that you are to do A, B, or C. But it's also tied to your skill sets. So you have to have the commensurate skills. You can be like a really confident, you think you're a really confident electrician. But if you've never wired a receptacle before, that's a problem. The confidence isn't going to help, when you're wiring the receptacle. But the third thing that builds confidence is affirmation from God's people. And that just takes time with God's people. God's people will affirm you either by their silence, their encouragement, or their rebuke as to where you should be plugged in ministry. The joke is if you think you're a counselor and every time you counsel, everyone's discouraged, maybe that's not your thing, right? So that's just time in the trenches. And I think that we also need to remember that the process of discovery, even though it can be confusing and hard, is part of God's sanctification and preparation process for us as well. Not just the actual hands-on lawyering, but the process of getting there. Not just being elected to office, but the process of getting there. God is sanctifying us day by day, and we need not worry too much about tomorrow. I would say prayer increases confidence, fruitfulness increases confidence, and the affirmation of God's people increases confidence, but it doesn't happen overnight. Yeah. Okay.